What's good, everybody? It's your boy Big Nate. Welcome back to Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best reading clubs. Today we are discussing the one and only short story by Toni Morrison, Recitatif. I believe that's how you say it, Recitatif. Which is going to be full of wonderful, great themes. I'll just let you know right now. The shtick with this is the story of these two little girls who are basically meet in an orphanage, and they're like 8 years old, somewhere thereabout. And the whole shtick is that one of them is black, one of them is white, and we do not know throughout the story which one is which. But depending on which is which, it makes all the difference. So, but it's much more than this. We're going to get into class. We're going to get into psychology. I got my handy dandy Freud right here. We're going to be talking about repression, psychoanalysis, all this good stuff. There is so many different aspects of this story that are fire. So that is the story we are discussing today. I'm very hyped to do it. I hope some of you guys are too as well. And without further ado, we finna get into the introductory segment. I got my cup of tea, you already know. We're going to talk about what books we are reading. And, you know, that's that. So let me take an initiatory sip. All right, and as people are funneling in, I'm going to just talk briefly about Moby Dick, which I am still thoroughly enjoying. I'm probably like close to 100 pages in now. It's him and the homie Queequeg, which that was like a whole... I found that this book is like genuinely, so far, like I'm finding it entertaining. It's funny. It's even wholesome. But yeah, no, thoroughly enjoying this. It's much more entertaining than I thought it would be, considering it's, you know, like a old head classic Moby Dick. So, but yeah, they're basically getting ready to go out whaling. We've already got a little bit of hints. Queequeg already pulled up. He's the goat. He said this dude was clowning on him because he's like, basically they were like racist back then, and he's the so-called savage. Basically, he's from elsewhere, and basically he's a person of color, an original person of color. Someone was clowning on him. That fool gets drawn out overboard. Queequeg saves the day like it's nothing. Goes right back to smoking with his tomahawk. So he's the goat. But yeah, so as people are funneling in and whatnot, I'll just give it another couple minutes, but then we finna get right into it. So I'm gonna take another little sip. It's hot in my house, so if you see me I chose the worst time of day to be doing this because the sun is shining right on you, boy. But you know, that's cool. So all right, I think we will waste no ado. I'm just I'm making sure everything is right on I'm still new to the streaming stuff. I think we good. I think I'm online and everything. I see something that said dropped frames, but I don't think that means anything. But okay, so without further ado, we gonna get right into the story. Recitatif, which, you know what, before we even get into it, I think we can talk about this. So I'm gonna draw on this little essay by Zadie Smith, who basically wrote an introduction to Recitatif, and I thought, because it's an interesting definition. I remember when I first read this story, I was like, what does that actually mean? And I looked it up, and it didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but I'll read it now and just keep this in mind. So the definition of recitatif: musical declamation of the kind usual in the narrative and dialogue parts of opera or oratorio, sung in the rhythm of ordinary speech with many words on the same note. So I'll come back to that, but I'm almost imagining like the Hamilton, Aaron Burr, sir. I think, like, you know, the musical declamation, this ordinary like kind of music speech, or the tone or rhythm peculiar to any language. So that definition, I think, will become very relevant as we go throughout the story. And so I just wanted to plant that seed there, because, you know, it's like, why is it called recitative? What's that word even? So we'll just, you know, we'll keep that in the background. Okay, and then I say, let's just get right into it. All right, so the story starts off. She says, "My mother danced all night and Roberta's was sick. That's why we were taken to St. Bonnie's. People want to put their arms around when you tell them you were in a shelter, but it really wasn't bad. No big long room with 100 beds like Bellevue. There were 4 to a room, and when Roberta and me came, there was a shortage of state kids, so we were the only ones assigned to 406. So in this first paragraph, we already are getting some interesting information. So my mother danced all night and Roberta's was sick. it's kind of implied, especially as the story goes on. My mother danced all night, and she's in a an orphanage, essentially, St. Bonnie's. So the idea is, like, at the very least, she's like something like a stripper is the idea. Maybe even like a step further, like, prostitute. It depends on how you want to take that. But her mother danced all night, and Roberta's was sick. And we come to learn that the narrator and Roberta are sharing the same room. Normally, it's like because they even kind of like switch beds and stuff, right? It's so there's four beds to a room, but it's just her and Roberta, and so we get the moment that they essentially meet each other. It didn't start out that way. The minute I walked in and the big bozo introduced us, I got sick to my stomach. It was one thing to be taken out of your own bed early in the morning. It was something else to be stuck in a strange place with a girl from a whole other race. And Mary, that's my mother, she was right. Every now and then she would stop dancing long enough to tell me something important, and one of the things she said was that they never washed their hair and they smelled funny. Roberta sure did. Smell funny, I mean. So when the big bozo said, Twyla, this is Roberta. Roberta, this is Twyla. Make each other welcome. I said, my mother won't like you putting me in here. So again, there's a lot going on in just this paragraph. She's introduced, she gets sick to her stomach because she's sharing a strange place with a girl from a whole other race. And again, we do not know who is who. So, and I think it was because of this actual reaction, actually, that I kind of had implicitly associated Twyla as being the one that was white. But it's by no means, like definitive at all. And it's, as we will kind of talk about, if anything, the assumptions that you make of what race the characters are, implicitly or explicitly, almost say more about what the reader brings to it. It says more about them than anything else. So I think I originally had just, implicitly kind of understood this. Like, it's almost like the white person, especially at that time, would be the one kind of like actively racist, I guess, in some sense. Or just like, oh, my mom's not going to like this. But it could totally go either which way, but that's where my head initially went with this thing. I didn't even realize until I read actually the essay by Zadie Smith, really, that you can't tell which race was which. So I didn't even notice that at first. So yeah, okay. So they meet one another, and she already says, my mother won't like you putting me in here. Good, said Bozo. Maybe then she'll come and take you home. How's that for me? If Roberta had laughed, I would have killed her, but she didn't. She just walked over to the window and stood with her back to us. I also want to flag this line, this passage. If Roberta had laughed, I would have killed her. It's like, that's fine, whatever. She's just a little 8-year-old. But this whole, like, I would have, like, I wanted to kill her, I would have killed her. That's something that pops up, throughout the story. And I want to talk about that from, like, almost like a Freudian perspective. What's good, Washington? Good to see you. What's up? What's up? Again, so, Roberta doesn't do anything. She just, what's up? Better late than never. That's what I always say. And so both, they get introduced for the first time, and, no real reaction from Roberta. She must have thought I meant my mother would be mad about my being put in the shelter, as opposed to, like, being, with another race. Not about rooming with her, because as soon as Bozo left, she came over to me and said, is your mother sick too? No, I said, she just likes to dance all night. Oh, she nodded, and I liked the way she understood things so fast. So for the moment, it didn't matter that we looked like salt and pepper. And so, like, again, there's some very subtle dynamics going on here. Their first introduction, first off, she says, ooh, my mom's not going to like this. But then, Roberta is like, is your mother sick too? No, she just likes to dance all night. And again, if you break those down, like, what does that actually mean? Her mother's sick, and Twyla's mother likes to dance all night. Again, it's kind of implied, this dance all night thing, or you might, like, want to ask questions, but I think this is something that Twyla really appreciates about Roberta, is she knows when to just kind of not ask questions, right? No, she just likes to dance all night. Oh. She nodded her head, and I liked the way she understood things so fast. So for the moment, it didn't matter that we looked like salt and pepper. So again, we're getting the, one is black, one is white, but it is by no means clear which is which. So, so she talks about they get to know each other. The two of them, they're the only ones that don't have essentially their parents are alive, right? They're at this orphanage. As she says, we didn't like each other all that much at first, but nobody else wanted to play with us because we weren't real orphans with beautiful dead parents of the sky. We were dumped. Even the New York City Puerto Ricans and the upstate Indians ignored us. So, already there's this divide, and I think, one of the things that, despite whatever their race is, in many ways they are brought together by something like, for instance, like class, or at the very least, the dynamics with being at this orphanage. They're the ones who actually have real parents, whereas all these other people, their parents have actually died, so they've been ostracized, and for that reason, the two of them grow close. And so we're just learning a little bit more about like the environment of St. Bonnie's, as it's called, and what it's like, and other people. So she talks about how the big girls on the second floor pushed us around now and then, but that was all. Basically, it wasn't that bad at St. Bonnie's. There's these big girls who are going to play an important role coming up here pretty soon. But he describes them as 15, 16, poor little girls who fought their uncles off but looked tough to us and mean. God, did they look mean. And she talks about how they'd light out after us and pull our hair and twist our arms and, all this other stuff. So, again, everyone's kind of hostile to them, even, as she says, the New York City Puerto Ricans and the upstate Indians. Everyone kind of ostracized them. There's like the older teenage girls, which already I think is interesting too, because it's like, it's already just revealing the dynamics, even of like the orphanage, the fact that we're going to talk about so many different, types of people, but just like the almost tragedy that there are these like 15, 16-year-old girls who are in this orphanage, and they're extremely mean, and especially with what they end up doing to one of the characters we're going to meet here, Maggie. I think that's just a little sort of sub thing that's interesting there. So let me take a little sip and we will continue. And so this is where we get our first introduction to Maggie, and I eventually want to lead. This is where a lot of the, I think, kind of Freudian stuff is going to come in, but I might be jumping the gun there. So she's talking about oftentimes these the teenage girls who would like pick on them. A lot of this happened at like this apple orchard, and she talks about how I used to dream a lot, and almost always the orchard was there. 2 acres, 4 maybe, of these little apple trees, hundreds of them. Empty and crooked like beggar women when I first came to St. Bonnie's, but fat with flowers when I left. I don't know why I dreamt about that orchard so much. Nothing really happened there. Nothing all that important, I mean. Just the big girls dancing and playing the radio. Roberta and me watching, and Maggie fell down there once. And that's like, I think, a key detail which we will definitely revisit. But she's there's talking about an apple orchard. This is where the girls would hang out. And again, something we will come back to by the end of this is the fact that she always is frequently dreaming about this apple orchard tree, and she doesn't know why, right? She's like, yeah, the teenage girls used to be there, but other than that, not much happened. Oh yeah, Maggie fell down there once. The kitchen woman with legs like parentheses, and the big girls laughed at her. We should have helped her up, I know, but we were scared of those girls with lipstick and eyebrow pencil. Maggie couldn't talk. And we learned that Maggie is essentially mute. She was old and sandy-colored, and she worked in the kitchen. I don't know if she was nice or not. I just remember her legs like parentheses and how she rocked when she walked. So it's like, Maggie is somewhat clearly suffers from, I don't know what the actual, disease is, but like the bow-leggedness, some kind of I guess like physical deformation where her legs are like parentheses, and she's this old woman who works in the kitchen, sandy colored, something else we will come back to, and she's mute, and on top of that she wore this really stupid little hat, a kid's hat with ear flaps, and she wasn't much taller than we were. A really awful little hat. Even for a mute, it was dumb, dressing like a kid and never saying anything at all. And this to me give me hints that Maggie might also have some kind of like developmental delays, if that makes sense, because she's mute, and on top of, not that is itself a thing, but just the way that Twyla is describing her, like with this sort of like little kid hat, and she's at the orphanage still, it's kind of it's giving things of that nature. And at some point, Twyla says, what about if somebody, can she talk, basically? What if somebody tries to kill her? Or what if she wants to cry? Can she cry? Sure, Roberta said, but just tears, no sounds come out. Which is honestly like, even just that line when I first read it, I'm like, damn, that's like just a tragic idea, right? You know, she can cry, but it's just tears, no sounds come out. She can't scream, nope, nothing. Can she hear? And then they said, let's try calling to her. And so they did. So they shout, dummy and dummy, bow legs. And so they're basically just, making fun of her. This old kitchen woman who can't talk, who's wearing this little kid's hat and, nothing. And we also know that Maggie gets picked on by the big girls, by the teenage girls. And so this was their little experiment to see if she could hear. And she says, I think we were wrong. I think she could hear and didn't let on, and it shames me even now to think there was somebody in there after all who heard us call her those names and couldn't tell on us. I think it was the day before Maggie fell down that we found out our mothers were coming to visit. So okay, we get that little introduction. Okay, cool. Maggie, there's the kind of big girls who are the bullies. There's Maggie. There's this apple orchard. But then we kind of move on, right? It was the day after Maggie fell down that we found out our mothers were coming to visit on the same Sunday. We had been at the shelter 28 days, and this was their first visit with us. And the two of them are super excited. They're curling each other's hair. And it's like, also, it'd been a whole month, and this is the first time, right? Unlike the other orphans, their parents are very much alive, right? It's apparent they're just in a case where apparently they don't feel, we don't know. Maybe it was like some CPS level stuff. Maybe it was like the kid was just kind of abandoned, cast aside. It's not clear. But, even after it's been a full 28 days, and this is the first time both of the mothers are coming to visit them. And then we get this little detail. So they're just very excited at the prospect of their moms coming. And so they're curling each other's hairs, and Roberta's socks were still wet. She washed them the night before and put them on the radiator to dry. They hadn't, but she put them on anyway because their tops were so pretty, scalloped and pink. And I don't know, for some reason that was such a poignant detail to me, like these little 8-year-old girls who are excited to see their moms, and they got these little frilly socks, and just wanting to be at their best dress to see their mom. And so she washed them and put them on the radiator, and they're not actually dry, but they're just so cute. She puts on these wet socks, which is the most uncomfortable feeling. I don't know, I just found this part very endearing, but also very sad that the girls are even in this situation, right? But and they have these purple construction paper baskets, and it's got jelly beans and stuff like that. It's just they've assembled these little baskets to give to their moms once they come to visit. And so yeah. So then the day eventually comes. The Sunday comes where their moms come, and they're both, Roberta and Twyla at this point are becoming closer and closer friends, and so they're excited for their moms to meet. And then, so eventually, when Big Bozo comes in, she actually has a smile, because we get the idea that Big Bozo is very draconian, very mean, stern. And this is the first time that they've ever seen her smile. And she says, "Don't you want to see your mommies?" And Twyla stands up first and spilled the jelly beans all over the floor. And again, there's something about this image to me that's just so, these little girls with the pink scallop socks, and she's so excited to see her mom. She stands up, and the jelly beans just fall all over the place. I don't know what it is. It's just these little details, which I feel like Toni Morrison is so good at doing too, that just I don't know, really, really evoke a certain feeling in you. At least they did for me. So they go, there's these whole lines of people, and then Twyla says, "I saw Mary right away. She had on those green slacks I hated, and hated even more now, because didn't she know we were going to chapel?" And as she talks, so these green slacks, and I think the idea, as Twyla points out later, that make her behind stick out. So if we're going with the interpretation, right, my mom dances all night. She's something like a stripper, and apparently Twyla is upset that her mom is essentially coming to a church service, right? Didn't she know we were going to chapel? And presumably especially for the time, some kind of promiscuous kind of outfit, something that's not necessarily dress appropriate for chapel. And then her mom, right, she's super excited to see her. Mary dropped to her knees and grabbed me, mashing the basket, the jelly beans, and the grass into her ratty fur jacket. Twyla baby. And then again, we get this weird line. She said, like, I don't know, I kind of picked up on this, but she says, because she's pissed that she worked so hard on that construction basket, and, you know, with the jelly beans, she was, like, meticulously building this basket for her mom, and the first thing that her mom does is just completely ignorant of it, gives her daughter a hug, which is nice and all, but it completely destroys the basket. She says, I could have killed her. Again, it's just like, I think it's almost like indicative to me of some kind of, like, you know, underlying trauma or some kind of stuff. Like, well, again, we'll talk about this with the Freudian stuff, but it just seems like a bit of an overreaction. And again, they're 8 years old and everything, but, like, you know, the idea, you know, I could have killed her. That comes up a couple. This is the second time we're seeing that. But, you know, and she was like, I can already tell the big girls are going to make fun of me. Twyla baby, you know, that whole thing. But I couldn't stay mad at Mary while she was smiling and hugging me. I wanted to stay buried in her fur all day. So even though her mom is just, like, totally embarrassing her, she is, she's still, you know, at the end of the day, it's still her mom. She's still, like, she's still glad that, you know, to be in her loving embrace. And then on top of that, I was feeling proud because she looked so beautiful, even in those ugly green slacks that made her behind stick out. A pretty mother on earth is better than a beautiful dead one in the sky, even if she did leave you all alone to go dancing. Again, I don't know what it is, but just these lines, I think it's just the fact that they're so young and, like, impressionable, and, like, they're in the orphanage, but still, it's just, like, so tragic to me. It's almost like the more wholesome it is, the more sad it is. You know, she's still proud of her mom, even if she did come in those, like, kind of inappropriate slacks. And, you know, a pretty mother on earth is better than a beautiful dead one in the sky, even if she did leave you all alone to go dancing. And, I mean, that almost just makes it even worse, because she's at an orphanage, right? So we hear all these other kids who are kind of like, they're ostracized because their parents are dead. But, I mean, just pointing to the whole institution of the orphanage, and of course everything that goes along with that. But so, I mean, just even alluding to that, right? All those other mothers, or all those other parents that these people have, you know, are dead, and these are kids that are completely alone. So then Roberta comes up. The two of them are all excited. They're all giddy, like, ooh, yay, we've been friends, and now our moms finally get to meet. Roberta said, Mother, I want you to meet my roommate, Twyla, and that's Twyla's mother. I looked up, it seemed for miles. She was bigger than any man, and on her chest was the biggest cross I'd ever seen, and in the crook of her arm was the biggest Bible ever made. And so what happens is, you know, Mary sticks out her hand to give a little handshake, and Roberta's mother looked down at me and then looked down at Mary too. She didn't say anything, just grabbed Roberta with her Bible-free hand and stepped out of line, walking quickly to the rear of it. Mary was still grinning because she's not too bright, she's not too swift. Then this light bulb goes off and she says, "That bitch," really loud, and us almost in chapel now. Everyone in the world turned around to look. So this whole exchange is crazy. And I think this is the first moment where, again, the notion of race here is interesting. Because if Roberta is white and her mother is also white, there is this element, you know, she refuses to shake Twyla's mother's hand, which we will assume here in this case that, like, if this is the configuration here, she's black. So the idea would be like, you know, she refuses to shake Twyla's mother's hand because she's a black stripper, won't even let her, you know, won't even touch her, grabs her daughter and goes to the back of the line. And, you know, so that's like, you know, that's one whole interpretation. But I, especially, you know, on that first read, this could also be totally read the other way, where, you know, she could just as easily be black. And again, we see that she's very much like, you know, about the Bible. She's Christian loving. So she may just be kind of like a sort of uppity, holier than thou woman who refuses to shake the hand of, again, she comes in those green slacks, which make her behind look big. She got the fur jacket, you know, kind of things alluding to that. And it could be she just, you know, doesn't want to touch, like, the white stripper's hand. And so she takes her daughter, you know, like, ooh, let's get away from her, and goes to the back of the line. Both of those are totally possible, but they're, you know, they're very different situations, right? This would give us completely different interpretations about, like, what actually happened here. So, again, so that's just kind of like one of the first of many things that are going to come where it's just like, okay, which is which, because it kind of, depending on the circumstance here, that might make, you know, a very big difference. And then Twyla's mother just is so just embarrassing her, making Twyla cringe, because all throughout the service she's basically slighted. She feels slighted because the mother didn't shake her hand, right? Also, you know, she just yells, "That bitch," and they're literally almost in chapel. You know, it's just like, bad look, bad look. And the whole time, she's twitching and crossing and uncrossing her legs all through the service. She even groaned a couple of times. Why did I think she would come here and act right? Slacks, no hat like the grandmothers and viewers, and groaning all the while. When we stood for hymns, she kept her mouth shut, wouldn't even look at the words on the page. She actually reached in her purse for a mirror to check her lipstick. All I could think of was that she really needed to be killed. So again, that's the third time now that Twyla has had like this, you know, like, I could have killed her. I wish she had been she needed to be killed. It's just like it's kind of like a violent reaction, I think, from like an 8-year-old girl. So, but yeah, and then, you know, again, we're getting more into the character of Twyla's mom, and none of this, I don't think, reveals any which way or the other as to the question of race, which I don't think is the central question of the story, but actually in some ways it is. I think Toni Morrison even says here, I have it somewhere. Toni Morrison says that the story was intended as an experiment in the removal of all racial codes from a narrative about two characters of different races for whom racial identity is crucial. So she very intentional, and so in many ways it is the central question of the story. And so she went out very deliberately to give a story that is completely devoid of being able to determine who is who, but in which, as she says, it's the story of two characters for whom racial identity is crucial. So, anyhow, none of this, I don't think, is giving us information one way or the other, but we are getting insight into Twyla's mom. She's at service. She's just being rude, right? Uncrossing her legs, twitching, groaning throughout the service. Doesn't even try and sing the hymns. She pulls out her mirror, right? It's like she can't even. And then the daughter is just pissed at this point. Just like, why did I think she would come here and act right? Just alluding to maybe the dynamics of what might have been going on too before they actually reached the orphanage. But just totally embarrassing, cringeworthy behavior. And yeah, so that's that. And then here, let me take a little sip. My bad, Nate. Finally got something. Oh yeah, no, you're good, bro. You're good. No problem at all. But yeah, so again, okay, so we find out that basically she on her worst behavior, Twyla's mom. And then it gets worse too. We were supposed to have lunch in the teacher's lounge, but Mary didn't bring anything. So we picked fur and cellophane grass off the mashed potato beans and ate them. Again, this is the fourth time now. I could have killed her. And it's very subtle. Like, I low-key didn't even notice this on the first read, but that's just a little sentence that just keeps on slipping out, which is very frequent and intense from an 8-year-old girl. And again, Mary didn't even bring her lunch, right? She comes, she destroys the basket that her daughter Twyla had been, so laboriously working on for her. She that bitch right in front of the chapel doors. She's making a fuss throughout the whole thing. Doesn't even try and pull out the hymns. Just very self-centered. Looks at a mirror, puts on lipstick. And then on top of that, she didn't even bring her daughter lunch. It's the first time she's seeing her daughter in basically a whole month. And she didn't even think to bring lunch. Whereas Roberta's mom did. Roberta just let those chicken legs sit there. Oh wait, okay, that was a second. I went a little ahead there. She said, I sneaked a look at Roberta. Her mother had brought chicken legs and ham sandwiches and oranges and a whole box of chocolate-covered graham. So Roberta's mother, on the other hand, brings her, all these different foods. And again, none of this necessarily tells us what one or the other is, right? It's like one mother brought lunch, the other one didn't. This doesn't tell you one way or another. In the food too, I mean, it seems like kind of a weird thing to focus on, but Zadie Smith in her essay here talks about how, let me see if I can find the quote. Yes, in a racialized system, all manner of things will be read as peculiar to one kind of person or another. Because again, reminder, recitatif means the tone or rhythm peculiar to any language. So the language of this racialized system, she's saying, in this case Zadie Smith, all manners of things will read as peculiar to one kind of person or another. The food a character eats, the music they like, where they live, how they work, black things, white things, things that are peculiar to our people and peculiar to theirs. So again, Zadie Smith here is talking about the food that a character eats, but again, this isn't telling in any way or another, right? Chicken legs, ham sandwiches, oranges, and a box of chocolate covered graham crackers. And all this is coming from, like, you know, the grandma, the old religious grandma. So, but, you know, I just thought I'd bring up that little part from Zadie Smith. Washington says, bro, it's crazy how fast Toni Morrison made it known. These girls have trauma. They have no siblings, no father figure in their lives, all with dialogue from their characters. Yeah, exactly. It all comes, I mean, even the first line, right? Like, my mother danced all night and Roberta's was sick. There's so much there. And again, like, we are just, like you said, Washington, from these little hints that we're getting of just, like, for instance, Twyla's mother's behavior throughout this whole story is just, like, you know, totally self-centered, couldn't care less about Twyla, or at least, you know, putting on appearances for her or anything like that. But yeah. And also you know, I could have killed her. That's I think I said that's the 4th time. So again, that to me almost reads like you said, Washington, the trauma behavior. It's just like a weird thing. You said I read it 3 times and got a new perspective of the story every single time I read it. Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. So, you know, Twyla's there. She's with her mom. They're picking up the fur because she, you know, broke the basket immediately, and they're eating jelly beans, whereas the other mother is, you know, brought a ton of food. But she says the thing is, Roberta barely drinks from any of this, eats any of this. Things are not right. The wrong food is always with the wrong people. And again, this doesn't, that seems kind of racially charged, right? The wrong food is always with the wrong people, but we don't see in which way necessarily it goes. Roberta just let those chicken legs sit there, but she did bring a stack of graham crackers up to me later when the visit was over. I think she was sorry that her mother would not shake my mother's hand. And I liked that, and I liked the fact that she didn't say a word about Mary groaning all the way through the service and not bringing up lunch. And this is where I think a lot of where the girls kind of share their bond. Twyla, you know, the fact that they just have this mutual understanding basically of the trauma, right? My mother dances all night. She, you know, she brings the graham crackers. She doesn't ask the obvious question like why your mom was acting that way. Like, you know, any normal kid, it's, you know, it's so obvious. You know, everyone in the world turned around, right? Because when you're at that age, that's how it feels. Just totally embarrassing. So of course it's like the main thing to talk about, but there's this unspoken rule, like we're not even going to address that. You know, here's some graham crackers. And just in that gesture, I think there's honestly so much within that. But this is why, you know, this is why Twyla likes Roberta. You know, she doesn't ask what she means by your mother dance all night. She didn't say a word about Mary groaning all the way through the service and not bringing any lunch. Washington dancing, was Mama Twyla a stripper dancer all through the night? That's what I think. I mean, that's the implication. Again, it's not clear. That's also kind of the beauty of the Toni Morrison. It's not like Twyla's mother. It's not like my mother was a stripper. It's, you know, my mother danced all night. I think that's what is getting at the very least. If anything, it could even go to, like, you know, levels of, it could be like prostitution, even something like that. But I think the safe kind of interpretation there would be, Twyla's mother is a stripper, CPS, or she just can't care for her, so she drops her off at the orphanage. So, you know, also just all of that lurking in the background, like these parents can't care for them, potentially, again, for, like, you know, different reasons. Roberta's mom is sick, but at some point these children are burdened to their parents. They don't, you know, even they're the ones who are abandoned. All these other people, they have big, beautiful parents who are dead in the sky, but their mothers are alive. They're just kind of bad people. That's like I think that's the implication. So. So Roberta brings, like, the graham crackers as almost like a little kind of peace gesture. And then we find out eventually, you know, the girls have been getting really close, but Roberta left in May when the apple trees were heavy and white. On her last day, we went to the orchard to watch the big girls smoke and dance by the radio. And again, here is this mention of the orchard, because you'll recall from earlier, she is constantly dreaming about the orchard. And in fact, let me pull up exactly what it said, because I think there was hold on, let me find it. Oh yeah, so she dreamed of the orchard, empty and crooked like beggar women when I first came to St. Bonnie's, but fat with flowers when I left. So like, I think she's saying in the dream, the orchards are, you know, like empty and crooked, but by the time they leave, they're full. And at this moment, right, they go to when Roberta is leaving in May, and the apple trees were heavy and white, which I think very much mirrors her dream. You know, when she leaves, the trees are now full again. So Washington says Roberta's mom was sick mentally, right? Man, there's so much depth in only 18 pages. You know what's funny? I didn't even go there. I actually thought she was just, you know, like physically sick. But for some reason, I don't know why, but for some reason I actually kind of pictured her like in a wheelchair at first. But I don't know, because on this reread, yeah, she's totally I mean, the whole point is she's like super big, right? She's huge. So she's, you know, she's standing. She doesn't seem, there's nothing described about her any kind of like physical sickness, which is what I was assuming. But now that you bring that up, Washington, that's a great point. Maybe I mean, she's very clearly like super, you know, like kind of like hyper religious with like this massive, you know, totem cross necklace that's sitting on her, and, you know, holding like this. She just pulls up to the orphanage with a massive Bible, you know, won't shake Twyla's mother's hand. But I hadn't even thought about that, Washington. That's interesting. That the idea that her mom might be like mentally unwell. But I think that might even be the better explanation as opposed to like some kind of physical sickness. That's actually a really good point. I like that. Because, you know, why couldn't she care for her if she was like sick? I mean, she seems perfectly able to, you know, go there and visit. But so yeah, okay, interesting. And so, yeah, there's these apple blossoms, right? All of this is happening. They're just kind of like reminiscing, and she's sad to see Roberta go and everything. But Roberta promised to write every day, which was really sweet of her because she couldn't read a lick, so how could she write anybody? And this is where we learn too, you know, Roberta was completely illiterate. And Washington said, bro, it's crazy because even after 20 or so years later, her mom is still sick. Yeah, that's a good point. That's another... Which begs the question. I mean, I actually I like that interpretation. I honestly hadn't even thought about her being like, you know, mentally unwell, but honestly, that almost seems like the more accurate kind of interpretation. And yeah, 20 years later, the mom never stops dancing, and you know, I love that too. When they're as adults, they still using that language. You know, is your mother still dancing? Nope, she never stopped. Is your mother still sick? Nope, she never got better. In between all that, reading between the lines, you know, like that's basically saying, you know, did your mom ever stop, you know, stripping, and did she come to actually care for you? Did she come pick you up from the orphanage and assume the role of a mother, and, you know, vice versa for Roberta? You know, all of that's, you know, is your mother still dancing? Nope. Or like, did your mother ever stop dancing? Nope, she never stopped. And there's just so much like contained just in that exchange there, which again that's the language they use even till their very last exchange. And again, so we realize Roberta is illiterate, and this is like, again, I'm tempted here because this is kind of, you know, whether I think it was part of the intention of the story to kind of, you know, at least the reader, it's inevitable to, like, you know, try and find clues about which race is which. And this, I don't think lends anything. If anything, it's just related to class, right? Like these are people who seem, you know, very poor, especially because like Twyla's mother, she said her idea of a good supper was yoo-hoos and popcorn, right? And, you know, presumably she's not rich if she was like put herself into the position of becoming like a stripper, you know, dancing all night. So it doesn't, you know, the fact that Roberta is illiterate, that could absolutely go either way. It could be kind of like the, well, you know, white trash, poor kind of aspect where it's like they don't, you know, undereducated, or it could be, you know, the other way completely. But, you know, it's still just sweet, right? Roberta promises to write every day, even though she doesn't even, you know, she doesn't know how to write. And so basically then we get a time skip, right? Bye Roberta, the memory of her kind of fades, and eventually I don't think it indicates how long after Roberta leaves, but presumably, you know, she's grown at this point. Twyla, who is the protagonist, by the way, which is another interesting element. Zadie Smith brings this up in her essay. It's like, on the one hand, it's like, maybe does the fact that Toni Morrison is writing from the first person perspective, does that almost like as a default should we assume Twyla's black? But then as Zadie Smith says, that doesn't make sense because Toni Morrison was never in an institution. She was it's completely fictional, and if anything you might even expect Toni Morrison to go with like the white perspective just to kind of subvert the reader. So that doesn't tell you anything which way or the other. What's good, Poopsie Tutor? Hello. Good to see y'all again. So we get this time skip, and eventually the two of them run into one another, right? So Twyla she's living now in the city of Newburgh, which we will come back to this later. And essentially, long story short, Roberta happens to come in, and Twyla instantly picks her out. She was sitting in a booth smoking a cigarette with two guys smothered in head and facial hair. Her own hair was so big and wild I could hardly see her face, but the eyes, I would know them anywhere. She had on a powder blue halter and shorts outfit and earrings the size of bracelets. Talk about lipstick and eyebrow pencil. She made the big girls look like nuns. So we're getting some of these codes, right? Her own hair was so big and wild I could hardly see her face, but that could go either way, right? It could, if she's black, I guess like one typical hair, like afro level kind of thing, or it could just be like white woman also like teasing their hair. Having hair that's big and wild isn't indicative one way or the other. Neither too with like the big hoop earrings and things like that, right? So again, cues that should be like hints, you intuitively want to think they're hints, but they don't. It's not like one of these is, again, coming back to the recitatif, none of them is peculiar to one or the other. And so she goes up, Roberta Fisk. She looked up, yeah? And then Twyla said, it's me, Twyla. She squinted for a second and then said, wow, remember me? Sure, hey, wow. It's been a while, I said, and gave a smile to the two hairy guys. Yeah, wow. You work here? Yeah, I said, I live in Newburgh. Newburgh, no kidding. She laughed, then a private laugh that basically she shares with the two guys that she's with, right? It's like, oh, you live in Newburgh? And they're kind of like basically laughing at her. And we don't necessarily know why, and I might take this opportunity to bring out the Zadie Smith stuff, but let's see Washington. It's all about classism. Yes, honestly, that's one of my big takeaways from here. And this is something that people like, I've talked about with other literature I've read, like MLK and them. It's like, class is so much more, obviously there are things that are specific to race, but a lot of the issues here are really matters about class. It's just so impressive how well Toni Morrison completely left out the race aspect of it and left it to us. As a society, sometimes we focus so much on race rather than the differences in culture and or status. Yeah, exactly. And then the classism stuff too is going to become relevant because later we find Roberta had married like, a super rich dude. She's got like diamonds on. She's all decked out. They got a driver, right? But that could go either way. But the class dynamics here. And then, okay, so I wanted to bring this up here. So, she, Newburgh, no kidding. She laughed in a private laugh that included the guys, but only the guys. And so I was like, I wasn't sure about Newburgh, and honestly, I didn't get too much of it except until I read this Zadie Smith essay. So I wanted to talk about. Hold on, did I pass it? Hold on. Hold on, let me just find this real quick. Because it was really interesting. It has a history that further confuses the whole matter as well. So, okay, how am I not finding this still? Oh, here we go. Okay, so this is Zadie Smith now writing about Recitatif. She says, geography in America is fundamental to racial codes, and Newburgh, 60 miles north of Manhattan, is an archetypal racialized American city. Founded in 1709, it is where Washington announced blah, 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 blah. Basically, it became a grand and booming town with a growing black middle class. The Second World War manufacturing boom brought waves of African-American migrants to Newburgh, eager to escape the racial terrorism of the South, looking for low-wage work, but with the end of the war, the work dried up. Factory jobs were relocated south or abroad, and by the time Morrison wrote Recitatif, Newburgh was a depressed town hit by white flight, riven with poverty and the violence that attends poverty. So we're going to talk about this too, because eventually Twyla marries a man who has lived in Newburgh for years, and they have a memory of the good old days of Newburgh. But that could be because at this point, Newburgh was earlier, right, in the good old days, so to speak. It was a booming town, right, that ended up having a growing black middle class. So this is like where black people fled the South, the terrorism of the South, as she says, to go to Newburgh, where there's it sounds like the way Zadie Smith describes it, some level of like economic and social mobility. But then eventually the work dries up, right, and then it's associated with white flight and becomes full of poverty. So just keeping a little bit of context, right, because clearly there's something going on here with the Newburgh. She said, "Oh, Newburgh, no kidding." She laughs. And then her and her little homies start laughing at Twyla. And basically, and then it gets quiet, right? It's like, okay, your turn to talk. Like that was kind of rude, but she doesn't respond. Instead, she lit a cigarette off the one she just finished and said, "We're on our way to the coast. He's got an appointment with Hendrix." She gestured casually towards the boy next to her. It's like, okay, Hendrix, whoa. And she said, "Hendrix, fantastic." I said, "Really fantastic. What's she doing now?" And then they just basically like they roll their eyes and they laugh at her. "Hendrix, Jimi Hendrix, asshole. He's only the biggest. Oh wow, forget it." Right? So she doesn't know who Jimi Hendrix is. And and then also we have Roberta, who is with people who are at some level, one of them is going to play a show with Jimi Hendrix. And it's like, Jimi Hendrix, obviously a major African-American figure, huge with like black culture. But Jimi Hendrix was also, and Zadie Smith writes about this too, he, had just as many white fans as he did black fans. That's why Jimi Hendrix is such a perfect example here. And whether you're black or not, in this case, you might not know who Jim, right? If you're just from a small kind of like country town, you don't really keep up with that kind of stuff. Maybe you don't know Jimi Hendrix, right? Then like it doesn't tell you one way or the other. It's like perfectly ambiguous, as Zadie Smith writes about in this essay, and that's why he's such like a good pick for this. Like wow, you don't even know Jimi Hendrix, asshole. He's only the biggest. Oh wow, forget it. And then Twyla says, "How's your mother?" I asked. I think because she's a little miffed, I think is the word. She's a little pissed at like the reaction, right? So she's, how's her mother? She knows her, with the orphanage stuff, right? "How's her mother?" I asked. Her grin cracked her whole face. She swallowed. "Fine," she said. "How's yours?" "Pretty as a picture," I said, and turned away. And that's basically their whole encounter. So it's like, okay, that was like a weird dynamic. The two of them were really close, obviously, when they were young, and they had all those bonding moments. And they're finally seeing each other, and this should be kind of like, a happy reunion moment. But the two are just very awkward, sort of standoffish with one another. And for instance, Roberta, it seems like she might be changed a little bit, right? She's the one who kind of seems unduly rude here. And we'll talk about this, right? Well, and just to kind of plant the seed, later on when they do see each other, she's basically, like, what was up with this interaction? What happened? And Roberta says, "Oh, you know how it was back then, black, white, like how it was." And so we'll talk about that. We'll do a little interpretation. But so anyway, that's the whole exchange, right? Very, very weird, awkward, standoffish. And so eventually we come to find out, again, another time skip. Twyla now is married to James, who is as comfortable as a house slipper. He likes my cooking. He's got this big, loud family. And James and their family, they have lived in Newburgh all their lives and talk about it the way people do who have always known a home. And again, they have lived in Newburgh all of their lives, and they're reminiscing on the good old days. If they lived in Newburgh all their lives, according to Zadie Smith and how she describes it, that could have been, it could have been a positive thing for both races, because this is a time where black people actually had some degree. There was a growing black middle class, so that'd be huge for them. And, they've lived there all their lives. But again, obviously, it could be true vice versa as well. Half the population of Newburgh is on welfare now, but to my husband's family, it was still some upstate paradise of a long time past. And then basically she ends up going, there's like this new food store that opens up, long story short, blah, blah, blah. She goes to this food place, and who do we see? Waiting in the checkout line, I heard a voice say, Twyla. The woman leaning toward me was dressed to kill, diamonds on her hand, a smart white summer dress. I'm Miss Benson, I said. That's what Twyla was, right? I'm Miss Benson. Ho ho, the big bozo, she sang. For a split second, I didn't know what she was talking about. She had a bunch of asparagus and 2 cartons of fancy water. Roberta, right? And then I think it's interesting too. The first time that Twyla runs into Roberta, what's this say? Follower goal met, 40 out of 40. Okay, nice. I don't know if you guys see that in the chat. Something just popped up. Follower goal, nice. Okay, shout out. We got 40 followers. But so the first time that Twyla sees Roberta doesn't recognize her, right? She's like, she said, oh, wow. Like Roberta Fisk? Yeah, Twyla. She squinted for a second and then said, wow, remember me? Sure, hey, right? So she didn't recognize her at first. And then now it's this time, right? Now it's Twyla who does not recognize Roberta. She says, I'm Mrs. Benson. Ho ho, the big bozo. For a second, she didn't understand it. And again, we're getting minor little details here, right? We saw it. Okay, nice, cool, good. But we're getting these minor details. Okay, so now we know Roberta has diamonds on her hand. She's dressed to kill, a smart white summer dress. So clearly kind of like, upscale, rich kind of vibe, right? Diamonds on her hand, right? She's clearly decked out. And on top of this, she had a bunch of asparagus and 2 cartons of fancy water. And I don't know about, this is also too where, I actually meant to mention this on the last one. There are certain cases here, certain situations where it's like, this makes me lean one way or the other. Like again, in the original scene where she's like, ooh, my mom's not gonna like that you put me here with her, right? I was giving me kind of like, it seemed like Twyla White was the the white one in that case. But then at the diner scene, it's almost like, because again, Roberta is the one who's being rude, right? Roberta is the one who's kind of like not dressing her like, just like that. Which that almost, and she said, oh, you know how it was, a black-white thing. Again, that could go either way, but to me that almost seems a little more like Roberta is the white-coated one here, because she's like trying to like, not talk to her. And then in this case too, I think it's almost, it's related to that, right? It's, to me, and obviously it could go either way, but it's like this scene is a little more white coated to me as well. Like Roberta, she's got diamonds on her hand, she has a bunch of asparagus and 2 cartons of fancy water. Like it's giving me like Whole Foods vibes. But again, that's even the thing, right? I think what's really interesting, what we've talked about it too, is why do I think like the diamonds and the asparagus and the fancy water? Why would that be something I associate with a white person any more than like a black person, right? It's like what you bring to this and the way you interpret the codes, the racial hints, as we would say, is itself, it kind of like forces the reader to think about like, why do I think that, right? And I don't think that strongly. This is just one of those scenes where it was like, the scales tipped a little bit, like maybe it's actually the other way, right? So, but again, it could be totally, Zadie Smith also talks about this, if anything, you could still, right, be, in this case, Roberta could be a black woman who just still, like, within her own class, within her own race, seeks like kind of a better financial position, right? And talks about how there's certain privileges that come with that, blah, 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 blah. Absolutely possible on both ends. And again, it's interesting if you ever find yourself thinking like, oh, I think this hint makes me think that they're white, or this thing makes me think that they're black. You should ask yourself why. And yeah, it just leads to some interesting stuff. But the two here, much better terms, right? Roberta, oh my goodness. And she's like, right, yeah, for heaven's sake, Roberta. Like, how did I not notice? And the two of them, like they're at the grocery store and they eventually meet to go outside, and she's like, meet me outside. And they're on much better terms here, right? This is how it almost like how you would have expected it to go in the first place. So she's outside waiting, and Twyla's describing Roberta now. She was waiting for me, and her huge hair was sleek now, smooth around a small, nicely shaped head. Shoes, dress, everything lovely and summery and rich. And then there's this interesting line. I was dying to know what happened to her, how she got from Jimi Hendrix to Annandale, a neighborhood full of doctors and IBM executives. Easy, I thought. Everything is so easy for them. They think they own the world. A very interesting dynamic. Again, this is where it whether or not Twyla is white or black, those could have very different meanings. And especially at this time, doctors, IBM executives, I personally think of those as like, higher upper class, working jobs, things like that. And I might be inclined to say, especially at that time, they might be more so white. But again, that's almost, there's some kind of bias there. It's like, why? Okay, so there's doctors and IBM executives. Why would you assume what does that tell you about whether or not Roberta's black or white? But then there's that quote, right? Easy, I thought. Everything is so easy for them. They think they own the world. And so, and that's Twyla saying that. And obviously, like, if Twyla is black, this makes sense, like, they're obviously, like, the white people are the one, like, in the privileged class. They're the one who gets to benefit from all, like, the, social and, like, racial elements. Everything is so easy for them. They think they own the world. So, I think that makes is very consistent with something with, like, Twyla being black in this case. But it's also totally consistent if Twyla's white, right? Easy, I thought. Everything is so easy. They think they own the world. Like, this sounds like it could be the language of, like, like a bitter white person talking about black people. They think they own the world. Who do they think they are? And maybe even some degree of envy, because in this case, if Twyla is white and Roberta's black, and Roberta is in and this is where the class stuff comes into, like, kind of we were talking about Washing Toad. There could even be some level of envy there. Oh, they think they own the world. This could be her taking out her anger on the fact that Roberta is decked out with diamonds, and as we see too, she's got a driver. There's like a limousine. Let me even just read that part. But I thought that was a really interesting line, right? They think they own the world. Who is they, right? It makes all the difference. As Toni Morrison says, this is a story for which the racial codes is essential, but we don't get any indication. So, and they're talking, and she said, "Oh," Roberta says, "Put them in my car. It's right here." And then I saw the dark blue limousine. "You married a Chinaman?" "No," she laughed. "He's the driver." And so, she's literally decked out in a limousine with a driver. Like, that is some serious upper class shit. Which again just makes this whole dynamic weird, and again could lead into how you interpret their reactions. Washington says, "I've honestly never read something this introspective, man. I've had to question my own biases this past week, and really have had to ask myself, does race really matter all that much, or is it really about the culture differences between people?" Yeah, I agree. Right. And this need we have, and it could be, within the context of the story, it's like there is this pull to want to know, okay, but what is she really? Like, there's this sort of fun puzzle game, like, let's take the clues. But, that principle of what we're doing in the story, is that something that we take with us in society, right? Are we always trying to figure out which category someone belongs to, whether it's black or white, whether it's, like, upper class or poor, right? Are we always trying to categorize people based off of, different things? And what is essential to, this is something that Zadie Smith talks about in the essay as well. What is it that makes someone, essentially black? What is it something that makes someone essentially white? And ultimately, nothing, right? Black people and white people are people all the same, right? There's a common human element. In any attempts at categorization and trying to figure out, like, again, this is the recitative thing, which is peculiar to each race, which is peculiar to the language. I'm speaking that, culturally, which is peculiar to each. That's the central question. Here, hold on. My battery. Let me get my charger real quick. My battery's gonna die. One sec. Right. But this is also on top of anything, and this is something that I like about the story too. you know, at the end of the day, throughout all these different layers, I think the bottom most fundamental thing is the fact that these are two people, two girls in the beginning, obviously, that shared like this moment in time, like this traumatic moment during which they shared a very special bond. And, you know, so you know, there's all this extra crap, but at the end of the day, I love this scene too, these scenes, because it's like, you know, these are two people who are reuniting, right? And yeah, so like just that whole aspect, you know, just the fact that these are two girls who had that moment together. So Washington says, example, there is an American culture overall, but also there is such a thing as white American culture, black American culture, Chinese American culture, Mexican American culture. Exactly, yes. There are different, you know, aspects, and like Zadie Smith too. Let me see if I can find it, because I think she's talking about Toni Morrison. And you can kind of interpret it two ways. It's like, there are people that can have like, you know, oh, here we go. So Zadie Smith says, when we're talking about these things, there's that which characterizes, and I think within the context of race, but you know, when we think about there's that which characterize, that which belongs exclusively to, and that which is an essential quality of. And, you know, there could be certain, right, like, yeah, different cultures have different characteristics, but none of them, I think we would want to say, is like an essential quality, right? It's not like black people must have, you know, such and such quality. Chinese people must have such and such quality, right? And that's like there's these three definitions that Zadie Smith talks about, that when we talk about, you know, what is peculiar to, in this case, for instance, race. Then there's also regional culture that separates us. New York City culture is very different from rural Georgia culture, regardless of race. Yeah, absolutely. And all of these things, not to mention the culture of, you know, like upper working class culture versus, you know, poor, impoverished culture, right? All these things are layering and overlapping together to just give us like this multi-dimensional dynamic that's taking place, right? Every time that Twyla and Roberta meet each other, oftentimes too in different circumstances in life, we are constantly, these different forces are kind of merging into like this one whole complex, of dynamics between them. Because, you know, like, again, Roberta is stupid rich. A dark blue limousine with a Chinaman, quote unquote, Chinaman driver. Right? And then Roberta, Twyla says, oh my, if the big bozo could see you now. We both giggled, really giggled. Suddenly, in just a pulse beat, 20 years disappeared and all of it came rushing back. And, you know, that's a moment to, like, you know, and they go into this coffee shop and they're just having a grand old time. Like, they can hardly contain their laughter. And it's like all that, I'm sure many of us have had that experience where, like, you meet up with an old friend and at first it's kind of like a little bit awkward, but after a few minutes, once you've kind of broken the ice, you guys just fall right back into step. That's what it feels like with Roberta and Twyla here in this case. It's like, you know, we both giggled, really giggled. Suddenly, in that pulse beat, 20 years disappeared, and all of it came back rushing again. You know, they're once again those two little girls who were lonely and found solace and friendship within one another, right? And so in just that moment, they come back to their real relationship. So they went into the coffee, again, just further emphasizing this. We went into the coffee shop holding on to one another, and I tried to think why we were glad to see each other this time and not before. Once, 12 years ago, we passed like strangers, a black girl and a white girl meeting in a Howard Johnson's on the road and having nothing to say. Now we were behaving like sisters separated for much too long. Those 4 short months were nothing in time. Maybe it was the thing itself, just being there together. 2 little girls who knew what nobody else in the world knew, how to not ask questions. And again, that's that idea. Just, you know, the accepting this accepting of each other where they were at that moment, right? Not asking, my mother dances all night, my mother's sick. It'd be natural to like kind of ask into that, but both of them recognize that there's some kind of trauma there, and so just, you know, ignoring that, right? Knowing how to not ask questions, and that's what really made them bond together, even, you know, against all odds and in such an unlikely scenario, right? And, you know, they're laughing so hard that their that heads turned and made the laughter even harder to suppress, right? They're just having a grand old time. And it is interesting. I don't know if people have thoughts on this, because frankly, I don't. But what is it about this time that makes it so different? I mean, we'll get into this a little bit, because when Twyla asks, Roberta says, "Oh, you know how it was back then, black, white." So maybe this was a time in history where the racial tensions were a little higher, and maybe that was why, right? They're in this public place. I mean, again, it's like, is Roberta black and a white girl comes up to them and it's like, oh, I don't want to be seen associating with, the oppressor, so to speak. Or is Roberta white and a black girl comes up and she's like, oh, I don't want to be associated with a black girl, right? So again, the totally different interpretations. But this is, I mean, as far as, what was the difference? Maybe it has something to do with the historical moment in terms of how race was in the culture. Washington says, Toni Morrison tells a story where the race and or skin color of the characters really has no effect on how it made me feel or contemplate. Yep, exactly. So, they're talking, and so Roberta says, I miss Kenneth Norton. The names are interesting too, like Twyla, Mary, the mother of Twyla, right? Roberta, Miss Kenneth Norton. And then it's just like they're just ambiguous, right? They could just go either way. Like down to the names, I think this story is so masterful. Washington says also how much poison parents can instill their kids just by how they express themselves about other people. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. So yeah, Roberta says, now I miss Kenneth Norton. Sounds like a mouthful. It is. Servants and all. Roberta held up 2 fingers. I think this is another interesting moment, right? Like, servants and all, like, obviously this has like at least light allusions to slavery, right? Servants and all. Roberta holds up 2 fingers. Which one is it? Again, your interpretation. We've talked about how it could, right, this like super rich status that she's reached to could be interpreted either way. But this is a bit of a stretch, but for instance, there is like the trope of like the black person, especially at this time, who works their way up and essentially becomes a sort of a white man. I forget there's a term. I don't think Uncle Tom is exactly the term for that, but right, once they've ascended the social ladder, they turn around and do the same things that white people do. They try and get acceptance from white people. I don't know exactly what that term is, but that could be one way, right, that we're looking at Roberta if she's black, or she could just be white and it's like, yep, I have servants, nothing crazy there. So right, and then again, she said, ow, what does he do? Computers and stuff, what do I know? Blah blah blah. So he's presumably one of Miss Kenneth Norton, Roberta's husband, is presumably one of these IBM people that he's talking about. Okay, and then it's been a little bit since we talked about her. But this is like one of my favorite parts of the story, right? So they're just talking, and Twyla says, I don't remember a hell of a lot from those days, but Lord, St. Bonnie's is as clear as daylight. Remember Maggie, the day she fell down and those gargoyles laughed at her? The gargoyles thing was like a little inside joke they have about gargoyles, and she misheard it and heard gargoyles, and it's so whatever. That's what they called the big girls, the teenagers who kind of picked on them. Remember Maggie, the day she fell down and those gargoyles laughed at her? Roberta looked up from her salad and stared at me. Maggie didn't fall, she said. Yes, she did. You remember. No, Twyla. They knocked her down. Those girls pushed her down and tore her clothes. In the orchard. Ding, ding, ding. Again, the orchard, by the way. That's she used to have those she vividly dreamed about the orchard. And she's like, I don't know why. Nothing really happened there. The mean girls were there. And, oh, yeah, there was that one time that Maggie fell down. We're going to find out there's a very traumatic incident that took place at this orchard. And we're finding out right now. So, no, Twyla, they knocked her down. Those girls pushed her down and tore her clothes in the orchard. Twyla says, that's not what happened. Sure it is, in the orchard. Remember how scared we were? Wait a minute, I don't remember any of that. And Bozo was fired. You're crazy, she was there when I left. You left before me. I went back. You weren't there when they fired Bozo. And then we find out that Roberta actually ends up having run away and this, that, and the other. But then Twyla says, are you sure about Maggie? Of course I'm sure. You've blocked it, Twyla. It happened. Those girls had behavior problems, Didn't they, though? But why can't I remember the Maggie thing? Believe me, it happened, and we were there. And so, okay, this is, I think, a fascinating fact. This is what really, when I first read the story, this whole dynamic is the thing that first stood out to me. This idea that, Twyla doesn't remember this event that took place. You know, like, man, remember the time remember the time Maggie fell down, and Roberta's like, wait, no, she didn't fall. She was pushed. The girls pushed her. Also, you know, just really rough stuff. The girls pushed her down and tore her clothes. You know, tearing her. And again, Maggie is an old, mute woman, maybe even deaf, but probably not. I mean, it's not clear, right? Because she thinks that she could understand her the whole time. But, like, you know, this old kitchen woman that's bow-legged, they push her down and tear her clothes. That is nasty stuff, you know? And they even said, you know, they had, you know, those girls had behavior problems. And it's like, yeah, that's... So, I mean, there's that whole dynamic, too, of just, like, how tragic it is for Maggie and, like, these girls who are also, you know, these teenage girls. Like, presumably this is what, you know, the little Twyla and little Roberta would grow up to be. You know, the Gar girls, the mean teenage girls that are doing this. And, in fact, Roberta says she ran away, too, right? I ran away because she didn't want to end up becoming like one of those girls. So, you know, but the thing is that's really bothering Twyla too. She says, that's not what happened. She says, wait a minute, I don't remember any of that. And then as Roberta says, you blocked it, Twyla. It happened. And so we're going to kind of transition to the Freudian interpretation of what's going on here, this idea of repression, and I think many of us can relate to it. And again, we'll talk about this, but it's like a traumatic thing that she's either ashamed of because she didn't help. This is like, she even says earlier in the beginning of the story, like the girls pushed her down or something like that. Something happened, and they should have stopped her, but they didn't, and she felt bad about that. But at this point, my ears were itching. This is Twyla. My ears were itching and I wanted to go home suddenly. This was all very well, but she couldn't just comb her hair, wash her face, and pretend everything was hunky-dory after the Howard Johnson snub. And no apology, nothing. So this is interesting on a couple levels. Like, Roberta confronts her about this thing that Twyla remembers is happening completely different. And again, this is like we're going to get into this deeper too, but there's a sort of deflection. There's like a psychological avoidance, She hears the two of them are having the best of times, right? They're laughing so hard that people are looking around. They're sisters. But all of a sudden, my ears were itching and I wanted to go home suddenly. And she's basically like, she couldn't just comb her hair, wash her face, and pretend like everything was good. So now she's kind of deflecting it, blaming it on Roberta. It's like, how are you going to just overlook what happened last time? Even though they were totally just fine. But then she brings up this sort of agitating memory of what happened with Maggie, and now all of a sudden she's kind of taking it out. She's like, well, how is Roberta how's she going to act like everything's cool? You can't just comb your hair, act like everything were good. And so Twyla says, were you on dope or what that time at Howard Johnson's? Maybe a little. I never did drugs much. Why? I don't know. You acted sort of like you didn't know me then. Oh, Twyla, you know how it was in those days. Black, white, you know how everything was. So again, she brings up the Howard Johnson incident because in some ways she's changing the subject because she doesn't want to think about it. But then this is where we get that really interesting line, which we already kind of broke down a second ago. How it was in those days, black, white, and so you could interpret it both ways. But so that's where we get that line. Drink break. And then, so basically they're chilling, they're doing their thing, and when they're getting ready to leave, right, Roberta says, by the way, your mother, did she ever stop dancing? I shook my head. No, never. Roberta nodded. And yours, did she ever get well? She smiled a tiny, sad smile. No, she never did. Look, call me, okay? Okay, I said, but I knew I wouldn't. Roberta had messed up my mind somehow with that business about Maggie. I wouldn't forget a thing like that. Would I? And I love that line. I wouldn't forget a thing like that, would I? She herself can't be so sure. And I don't know if you guys had instances like this, but sometimes when I'm reminiscing with the homies and we're just talking about old times, some people will bring up a story and it's like, I literally don't remember that. But they'll say I was there and everything. And there was another time this was actually relatively recently, And they were like, remember that one time we were all hanging and like, you know, this one thing happened? And I'm like, that 100% was not me. And they were like, yes, it was, bro. You were there. And I was like, no, this time I'm certain I wasn't. And I actually wasn't. Like, we ended up kind of tracking it down, and I wasn't there. But, like, there were, like, 3 or 4 people there that were like, yeah, you were there, bro. And I'm like, bro, I was not, right? So this fickleness of memory, too. But then there are times where it's like, I don't remember it happening, and it ends up coming out that, you know, I did. Or it's like maybe with some occasional, or with some, you know, prodding, if they remind me, oh, remember this happened? It's like, oh, yeah, I do remember that, right? So, and then Washington, it seems like Roberta partied hard in her youth. Yeah, I mean, she even says something like, you know, man, we were wild back then. I don't know how we got out of it alive. And again, doesn't tell you anything, but it's interesting, right? And yeah, Poopsie Tutor. So it sounds like you've had some kind of similar experience with this, where it's like there's this blurring of memory. And I think that's also normal, but there's also this element of like repression too. And that's where I wanted to bring out Freud. So this is from an essay he's talking about called Screen Memories, and it's the idea, and this is just a basic psychoanalysis principle idea in general. Whenever something happens, like this is a great example, right? This idea that like Maggie, this old woman, got, you know, knocked down. They're tearing at her clothes, like. I mean, the really nasty version of that is like they're like stripping her, you know, like they're just totally like tearing her apart, and she's left in this totally vulnerable, you know, horrible state. So that you could see how that could be traumatic for an 8-year-old girl, just, you know, watching that. And so an idea that, like, again, in psychoanalysis, is something like that because it's so unpleasant and brings about memories of shame. She even says in this, you know, it brings me shame now even to think about it, right? That's a type of memory. That's the idea of, you know, sweeping it under the rug of our mind. We want to avoid thinking about that. And so we repress it. And so I wanted to talk about this. So there's some, an idea by I keep wanting to say Jung. There's an idea with Freud where it's like, you know, he says in adult psychology, right, when we're full adults, we would expect that, you know, based off our experience, certain impressions would be selected as worth remembering, namely those which produced a powerful affective impact. So it's like, you know, in normal adult memory, the way we think about it, right? Things that are impactful, emotionally significant. Obviously, those will be the things that we remember. But what we find is like oftentimes younger children kind of show the exact opposite effect. So he says it is grossly at odds with this expectation and bound to cause some justifiable surprise when we hear that the content of some people's earliest memories consists of everyday impressions that are of no consequence, but were nevertheless noted in copious detail. Whereas other roughly contemporaneous events are not remembered, even though the parents testify that the child was profoundly affected by them at the time. So let me just break that down a little bit. He's talking about how people, oftentimes their earlier memories, they will remember things that are completely unimportant, right? Like why? Because it's like there was nothing emotionally significant about it, just a totally commonplace event. Whereas things that were super consequential, super emotionally impactful, children will just apparently forget. And this is his idea of what a screen memory is, right? So he says, instead of that memory image that was justified by the original experience, we are presented with another, which is to some extent associatively displaced from it. Since it was the significant components of the impression that made it objectionable, these must be absent from the memory that replaces it. So basically just breaking that down. You can have like a traumatic memory, but because it's traumatic, right? Because you want to repress it, you essentially want to forget that it happened in the first place. What happens is it displaces to something that happened nearby in time, right? So you'll remember something that was totally inconsequential, but that it happened, you know, in the same place or around the same time as like this traumatic memory. So you repress the traumatic memory, and that, again, for lack of a better word, that psychological energy gets displaced, and now for some reason you remember very vividly these seemingly inconsequential details. And I think this is almost what's going on with the orchard tree, right? She has very strong memories of the orchard tree, which is where we find out all of this happened. But, you know, she totally forgot about the Maggie thing, right? She's like, wait, what? That didn't happen. They weren't, she fell. They weren't pushed. And, you know, Roberta is insistent. No, I promise you, they were pushed. You were there. It happened. So she forgot that. This is totally in line with the Freudian idea. She totally forgot that part. But then it sort of the neighboring things sort of get infused with this new psychological meaning. Now she's dreaming about the apple orchard all the time. And of course, that's another major principle of psychoanalysis. Things that you repress, things that you avoid, that's when they manifest in dreams. I mean, many of us have dreams that we are either ashamed of, or there's things that that get brought up that we have been actively avoiding, right? That is it's like what Freud says, right? Or just in general, the principle, dreams are communications from the unconscious, and within the unconscious is where all these events, these traumas, these repressed memories come by. So this is why she's dreaming of the apple orchard all the time, and yet she can't recall the actual event. That's at least one interpretation there. So yeah, I can just kind of skip the rest there. But I thought that was a really interesting kind of Freudian interpretation, which fits really well with, the whole dynamic of what's taking place here. Okay, so Washington Toad says it's possible that all that partying could have potentially messed with her memory. I think that's totally a part of it too. But were you saying Roberta or Twyla partied a lot? Because Twyla is the one who forgot. And so, but maybe Roberta's misremembering it too, because that's what we're talking. Maybe Roberta's the one misremembering it. Maybe it's actually Twyla was right. Maybe Maggie really did fall down. I mean, we're gonna see some other versions of this, right, as we go on. But the unreliable narrator, except they're both unreliable, and this is also just a general principle about human memory, right? Human memory is unreliable in general. But yeah, this is such an important defining memory that it's like, how could you possibly forget the details of that? But the two of them have totally different ideas of what's actually happening. So I feel like it's reactionary forgetfulness sometimes too. Yeah, exactly, Poopsie Tutor. It's that you don't want to think about it, right? So you push it out of your mind. It's something that you're ashamed of, right? So you just sweep it under the rug. And yeah, the Roberta, I mean, that's the thing, Washington. It could go, but Roberta, maybe she is completely misremembering it. Because she doesn't even admit later, and I won't get to it. We'll wait till we actually get to the part, but Roberta admits that she did, in fact, misremember, right? I told you this happened, but that's not how it happened. It happened this way. There's some other interpretations about that, but let's move on. I just wanted to take that little detour with the Freudian analysis of what was going on here. So, sip break. So, I wouldn't forget a thing like that, would I? That whole thought process takes on this whole new meaning, I think, in light of, some of the ideas we just talked about with Freud. I wouldn't forget about that, would I? But we all have cases where we have forgot about something that, some important detail, some important memory, or we have, conversations with friends where that same thing's happened. They say this happened, I remember it this way, but both of you guys swear that yours was the actual way it happened. So here we go, another time skip. Strife came to us that fall. At least that's what the paper called it. Strife. Racial strife. Yeah, sit break gang, you know how it is. Also I love to, and we're going to get to it now also, the whole underlying idea of these racial tensions, right? We've talked about class, we've talked about the individual elements of race, right? With the one girl's black, one girl's white, but also the historical political background of race as well, where it's what's happening here is basically the Brown versus Board of Education, where schools are now being integrated together. So that's, all of this is happening in the background. And she's talking about her son, Joseph, was on the list of kids to be transferred from the junior high school to another one at some far out of the way place. And I thought it was a good thing until I heard it was a bad thing. And so this, she's talking about integration, desegregation of schools. And so eventually she's driving, she's just out and about, and she sees a line of women marching. And who do you suppose was in line, big as life, holding a sign that said, "Mothers have rights too," right? And of course, that is Roberta. So once again, I don't know how many years it's been at this point, but some element of time skip, and now we're in whenever, desegregation of schools took place. But right, Roberta, she has this sign, "Mothers have rights too." And so she had, Twyla drives on and then changes her mind. She decides, okay, let me circle back and say what's up. And, she says, "Hi." This is also just weird dynamic. Again, each time they visit each other is totally different. So, Roberta sees her, comes up, "Hi, what are you doing?" "Picketing. What's it look like?" "What for?" "What do you mean, what for?" "They want to take my kids and send them out of my neighborhood. If they don't want to go." And now they're getting a little standoffish. So what if they go to another school? My boy's being bused too, and I don't mind. Why should you? And then Roberta says, well, it's a free country. And then Twyla says, not yet, but it will be. What the hell does that mean? I'm not doing anything to you. You really think that? I know it. And I love these two lines. Twyla says, I wonder what made me think you were different. Roberta says, I wonder what made you think you were different. The two of them they say the same thing. It's, total mirrors of one another. I wonder what made me think you were different. And that has, with the racial overtones, has, so many implications, right? So, and then again, we don't know. This is what's so genius. Roberta is picketing, right? She's got this sign, mothers have rights too. And it's like, what do what for? They want to take my kids and send them out of the neighborhood. They don't want to go. So what if you go to another school? My boy's being bused too, and I don't mind. Why should you, right? Two ways to think about this. Either Roberta is white, and she doesn't want hers, they want to take my kids and send them out of the neighborhood. They don't want to go. And she's white and is opposed to the idea of her white son sharing school with black children, or Roberta is black and just for similar reasons, they want to take my kids, send them to a whole different school out of the neighborhood. They don't want to go to a new school. They're already in their current school, right? And so it works just as well. And and so what if they, and Twyla says, so what if they go to another school? My boy's being bused too, and I don't mind. Why should you, right? And if Twyla is white here, it's like, my boy's being, I don't care if the desegregation thing's happening. Why should you? But if she's black, right, it's also like, if Twyla's black in this case, it's almost like a confrontation of Twyla, or Roberta. It's like, Roberta, why do you care, right? My kid's being bused. Why does it matter for you, right? Are you racist? Like, do you not want your white kid sharing a classroom with a black kid? Both of those interpretations are the same, or, could work. And again, just those perfect mirrors. I wonder what made me think you were different. And it's like, if Twyla is white, I wonder what made me think you were different, right? I have a preconceived idea, stereotype of what black people are. I wonder what made me think you were different. And then same thing if Twyla's white, or they both say it, so it doesn't matter, right? Looking at, like, let's just say Roberta is white, Twyla's black, and Roberta's white. I wonder what made me think you were different. That same thing, like, oh, you're another white person, right? You're just another person who doesn't want their kid getting sent to schools with black people. I wonder what made me think you were a different white person. Both of those lines just work so brilliantly. And if the two have just had these parallel lives, and so just like those two mirrors, I think that's just like, that's almost like the climax of the story to me. I thought it was just brilliant. And then Twyla says, look at them. Just look. Who do they think they are? Swarming all over the place like they own it. And now they think they can decide where my child goes to school. Again, if Twyla's white, it's very, kind of racist coded. Like, who do they think they are? Look at them. Now they think they can decide where my child goes to school, right? Because, like, presumably the Brown versus Board of Education was a push from, black culture to have schools desegregated. So if Twyla's white, who do they think they are that they can decide where my child goes to school? But the same thing works if they're black, right? Who are you to say whether, I think there's perfectly good reason if you're a black mother why you wouldn't necessarily want, especially if they don't want to go, to put your black kid with a bunch of white kids who are going to, like, pick on them, right? So it totally, both of these absolutely work. Right, and then so Twyla says, at some point, and what am I, Swiss cheese? I used to curl, and Roberta says, I used to curl your hair. Twyla said, I hated your hands in my hair. Again, very kind of like racially coded. Roberta, I used to curl your hair. If Twyla's white and she says, I hated your hands in my hair, again, it's kind of like racist coded, right? It's like, I hated your black hands in my hair. But if Twyla is black, same thing. It's like, I shouldn't have same idea of, like, I loathe to have, like, a white girl's hands in my hair as well. Same thing. Those are totally applicable. This does not tell you one thing or another, but it's still all the same, very, racially coded. And so the two of them, and the women now, right, who are picketing with Roberta, and because we don't know who is who, presumably there was picketing and protest on both sides, right? So the women were lots of emotions. Yeah, exactly. Yep. So the women, the ones who were picketing, were moving. Our faces looked mean to them, of course, and they looked as though they could not wait to throw themselves in front of a police car, or better yet, into my car and drag me away by the ankles. And again, once again, racially coded as hell, and yet we don't know which one it could be, right? If Twyla's white and the picketers are black, it's like this animosity that people have, rightfully so, around that time towards white people. If Twyla is wait, which one did I just? Yeah, okay, so that's what if Twyla is white. If Twyla is black, well then it's obvious in that case you have a bunch of white picketers who see this black woman coming, and they're in this case they'd be protesting against desegregation. Well then all of that's also kind of a scary mob situation. Both of them work again, but we don't see which way it goes. And then again, throughout all this, there's the human element. There is the personal relationship between the two. Automatically, because now there's like women kind of swarming Twyla's car. Automatically, I reached for Roberta, like the old days in the orchard when they saw us watching them and we had to get out of there. And one of us fell. Basically, they'd protect each other. They had this little system where if one gets taken down, the other one would fight, and neither of them would leave each other behind. And it's just, I love that it's this automatic reaction on Twyla. There's still at the end of it that relationship, that deep friendship and bond between Twyla and Roberta. She automatically reaches out her hand. My arm shot out of the car window, but no receiving hand was there. So obviously there's this tension, which has been taking place throughout the whole story. But yeah, so let's see. Mean things are being said out of emotions at this point. What up, Frank Ocean? Oh, I don't see Frank Ocean, manager. But what's good? Let's see. Okay, so yeah, so that's that scene. Again, yeah, they're being very kind of nasty to each other, and it's interesting how like the first time there was like that weird tension, the second time they're just like sisters again, and now at this third time in this like political sort of context, like they're being real nasty to each other, and now it's about to get real bad too. So Roberta says, maybe I am different now, Twyla. Oh yeah, here we go. Maybe I'm different now, Twyla, but you're not. You're the same little state kid who kicked a poor old black lady when she was down on the ground. You kicked a black lady, and you have the nerve to call me a bigot. And then Twyla, what was she saying? Black? Maggie wasn't black. And then, that Twyla says that. Like hell she wasn't, and you kicked her. We both did. You kicked a black lady who couldn't even scream. And then Twyla calls her a liar. And so this is also just like low-key a mind fuck, because it's like, damn. Again, so the first level being like this whole lack of memory that we were talking about, like the Freudian interpretation, the repression of these things, right? She already questions whether or not like it was the girls who pushed her down, or whether Maggie fell on her own. But now this is a whole different thing from left field, right? Now that you're the same little state kid who kicked a poor old black lady when she was down, you kicked a black lady, and you have the nerve to call me a bigot. And she says we both did, right? Roberta says we both kicked the black lady who couldn't even scream. And this is just like tragic on so many levels. Like, the whole race thing aside, just the treatment of Maggie here and this whole dynamic of memory and what actually happened. And also you kicked a black lady, right? And she says black. Maggie wasn't black. Like hell she wasn't, and you kicked her. And in the beginning, she describes like the very first time she describes Maggie, she says she's sand colored. And later on she says, let me find the line. So she said, it didn't trouble me much what she had said to me in the car. I mean the kicking part. I know I didn't do that. I couldn't do that. But I was puzzled by her telling me Maggie was black. When I thought about it, I actually couldn't be certain. She wasn't pitch black, I knew, or I would have remembered that. What I remember was the kitty hat and the semicircle legs. And we'll come back because she goes on there. But, it's, again, the whole element of memory. It's like, was she black? When I think about it, I really can't be sure. And also, she instantly rejects, I know I didn't do that. I couldn't do that. It's almost like, I know I didn't do that. I would never do such a thing, right? But she was already presumably wrong about one thing about her memory, right? Maybe she could, in fact, do that. And maybe she has no recollection of this because it was so traumatic for her that she just completely blocked it out. And, Roberta, she says we both kicked her, right? So... yes, exactly. Sandy skin, which is also beautifully ambiguous, right? Sandy skin. It's like it's like between white and like black. It's like it's ambiguous. Just another brilliant detail. So yeah, okay, right, and then the two kind of go on this whole campaign, which is just Roberta has her sign, mothers have rights, and then Twyla now all of a sudden, because she's kind of upset about this, and again she's probably upset because the deeper underlying thing which happened before, right? With she's upset because of this traumatic experience. She's not sure about whether or not this actually happened, and that really unsettles her psychologically. So she makes a sign, and so do children, right? Which is a play off of Roberta's. Mothers have rights too, and so do children. Which is funny because and they even said, their signs don't make sense without respect to one another, right? The two are intertwined in that way. And everyone's like, what the hell does your sign mean? But it's because she's directly addressing Roberta's signs. So yeah, the two are just kind of like, basically having like this little sign war, not really acknowledging each other. And again, it gets nasty. As soon as Roberta hoisted her "Mothers have rights" to, I began to wave my new one, which said, "How would you know?" Right? Just low. Like, how would you know? Either because she's like a stepmom, like she doesn't actually have kids. She married a widower with four kids, or it's like, how would you know? You never had a mom, right? Obviously. And then another sign, just nasty, which lends credence to the idea that maybe she is this like kind of bigot that takes out, right? This is really cruel stuff. And so you can only imagine, like, maybe it does make sense that when she was 8 and, really emotionally volatile and, angry and wants someone to take it out on, it's totally possible. I think, like, the fact that she's getting so nasty here, I think makes it seem very plausible that she could have, kicked Maggie. She could have actually, really done that. So yeah, let me just look at the chats here. Yeah, so Washington, I'm guessing she was light-skinned black, but when they were kids, like, literally had no racism in the reigns, which is why she refers to Maggie as sandy skin rather than right. Bro, the pettiness in Twyla is crazy. Goes back with her own damn. Yeah, exactly. She could care less about the Yeah, she even says, I thought it was a good thing until someone told me it was supposed to be a bad thing. So yeah, she doesn't care about the protest at all. And then just going low. How would you know? Is your mother well? Like, damn, that's fucked up, bro. That's real shitty. And then again, we get like some little details. When the schools finally opened, there were fights once or twice and some sirens roared through the streets every once in a while. There were a lot of photographers from Albany. It's not a central part of the story, but happening all in the background, setting the scene for their interactions is like this whole, historical political movement. And, it's because of that they have that they find each other, and this whole signs thing that they're doing back and forth, and the protesting, like, oh, why do you care if your kid gets sent to school? All of that is within this social context of desegregation taking place. So I just love those little details, right? There's so many different layers to what's happening in this story. And so, yeah, I just mentioned the part, she kind of is thinking about this whole thing. It sort of leaves her unwell. It didn't trouble me what she had said, the kicking part. I know I didn't do that. I couldn't do that, right? She's almost just categorically saying, I could never, right? Even though it's possible. But this is a key line. Eventually it dawns on her. I didn't kick her. I didn't join in with gargoyles and kick that lady, but I sure did want to. We watched and never tried to help her and never called for help. Maggie was my dancing mother, deaf, I thought, and dumb. Nobody inside. Nobody who would hear you if you cried in the night. Nobody who could tell you anything important that you could use. Rocking, dancing, swaying as she walked. And when the gargoyles pushed her down and started roughhousing, I knew she wouldn't scream, couldn't. Just like me, and I was glad about that. This is such, I think, a fantastic passage, right? My mother was Maggie. This is like the Freudian psychoanalytic. That's the idea of projection. And she, I didn't kick her. I didn't join in, but I wanted to, right? We watched, we never called for help. And, Maggie was my dancing mother, deaf, I thought, and dumb, right? Symbolically here, deaf to her child, right? She's somebody she's an 8-year-old girl who, again, like, deaf, I thought, and dumb. Nobody inside, right? She's just like this hollow mother who doesn't give a fuck about her daughter. Nobody there, right? She couldn't scream, right? Maggie couldn't scream. And she said, just like me, right? Nobody who could tell you anything, or nobody who would hear you if you cried in the night, right? Nobody who you could give you anything important that you could use. Just like this whole, like the idea, I mean, the projection here, right, is that Twyla is the one who could not like when she was crying in the night, right? But her mother wasn't there, and so her mother, was deaf and dumb, just like Maggie. So Maggie becomes the scapegoat for all of her anger and frustration and trauma and loneliness that she had as a child, right? Maggie was my dancing mother. I just love that line, and that's why she wants to kick her. And I think personally, I think it's totally possible that she did in fact, kick Maggie while she was down. And Roberta says later, we'll talk about this when the line comes up, when the scene comes up. But Roberta's like, I promised to tell myself if I saw you again. We didn't do that, right? That was just me. And tensions are high right now. Like the whole signs thing, they're getting low with one another. So she says, you're the same bigot that might have just been a spur of the moment, exaggerate. Maybe Roberta's misremembering it. She even says herself she's misremembering it. But the whole thing, I think, is unreliable. And the fact that Twyla hadn't even recognized this, right, about Maggie was my mother, and that she wanted to kick her, even if she didn't kick her, she says, it dawned on me, right? She's realizing it. She is uncovering that repressed stuff for the first time. So who knows what else is lying, deeper. If she continues to go deeper and deeper, maybe there is and again, maybe she blocked it out entirely, but it could be that lurking down very, very deep, because this is a horrible, horrible thing. So horrible that she might have as Roberta says, you've blocked it, Twyla. You blocked it. I think it's totally possible that she really did, kick Maggie. Washington, it's honestly impressive how she did not pass down that trauma to her own son. Yep. Who knows? Maybe she did. But yeah, no, she seems like she's got it together. But yeah, I just thought that passage was so powerful. Maggie was my dancing mother, deaf, I thought, and dumb. Nobody inside. Nobody who would hear you if you cried at night. I knew she wouldn't scream, couldn't, just like me, and I was glad about that. Just that projection, using her as that outlet for all her anger and frustration with her mother and her childhood, and just her entire experience up to that point. And so, deep stuff, and eventually the two basically just kind of it fizzles out, and we get to another time skip. So this is however many years later. It's Christmas. They're doing some Christmas shopping. This is going to be the last time, and this, I feel like this is a long one. My throat hurts. So we're getting to the final time, and I think the ending of this story is just again really, really powerful. But so they find each other one time, right? And she's outside, she's walking. There's like this fancy Newburgh hotel that people are coming out of. Men huddled in the snow were dressed in tails, and the woman had on furs. Shiny things glittered from underneath their coats. So this, again, a very kind of rich crowd. Shiny things glittered from underneath their coats. This is the very expensive hotel, right? And there she was in a silvery evening gown and dark fur coat. She sees Roberta. And so basically Roberta, basically the two go up to one another, and Roberta says, I have to tell you something, Twyla. I made up my mind if I ever saw you again that I'd tell you. And she says, listen to me. I really did think she was black. I didn't make that up. I really thought so. But now I can't be sure. I just remember her as old, so old. And it's like, God, this is so tough to, like, okay, for one, neither of them are sure what happened, right? She swore at that moment she's black. I was there. You're blocking it. But now she's saying, I really did think she was black. But now that I think about it, now I can't be so sure. But one thing she does know is she's old, so old. And just like this image of this, like, decrepit, like bow-legged old woman who has like on this little kitty hat, and she doesn't speak and she can't hear, she can't speak and may or may not be able to hear. And I just remember her as old, so old. And you have like these, whatever happened, there were people, kicking her. Whatever happened in this orchard situation, it's just so tragic. And she said, and you were right, we didn't kick her. This is Roberta. You were right, we didn't kick her. It was the Gar girls, only them. But well, I wanted to. I really wanted them to hurt her. I said we did it too, you and me, but that's not true. And I don't want you to carry that around. It was just that I wanted to do it so bad that day. Wanting to is doing it. And again, like, so much could be happening here in these lines. It could be that Roberta had, she also kicked her, like, right? They both joined in on it, right? There are these two girls who, and again, they're saying, both of them independently, they wanted to so bad, they wanted to kick Maggie, like we've talked about, as that outlet of frustration. And she's like, you know what, you're right, we didn't do that. But kind of weird, right, to so insistently say we both did, right? Where did that come? If they really didn't do that, isn't it a little weird that she'd bring it up, like, yeah, she was black and yes, we both did it? It's like, I feel like that doesn't come out of nowhere, and this would be very much make sense, like, if there's, this idea of repression again is getting brought back down. She said, no, we couldn't have done that, right? It wasn't, you were right, we didn't kick her. It was the gargoyles, only them. But I wanted to, and I mean, even if they didn't too, it's like Roberta says, I wanted to do it so bad that day. Wanting to is doing it. So there's even just that idea of the intention. It's just like, you could easily see how if they both, real like wanted to so bad kick Maggie while she's down, this old mute woman, it could be that they really did do it, and right, they're just having that confabulation memory. It's like, no, I didn't actually kick her, but I really wanted to, almost as a way of coping, as some kind of psychological protective defense mechanism, to think that they actually didn't. But anyway, sorry, I'm going off here. And then so Twyla says, we were kids, Roberta. Yeah, I know, just kids. 8. Yep, 8. And lonely, scared too. So they're just, and then bringing us back, grounding us. Like, they were these just little 8-year-old girls. Remember, Roberta has the little pink scallop socks that she's drying on the radiator, and Twyla put so much effort into that little the little construction paper basket. They were just kids, they were little girls who clearly had all these trauma. They were lonely and scared, and so, like, even in itself, like, obviously if that actually happened, that's not justifiable, but just like, this rage, this frustration that the girls must have because of their situation and just them being so young. But now we're getting to the good stuff. So, and then we're wrapping up here. Twyla says, did I tell you? My mother, she never did stop dancing. Roberta says, yes, you told me. And mine, she never got well. Roberta lifted her hands from the tabletop and covered her face with her palms. When she took them away, she really was crying. Oh shit, Twyla, shit. What the hell happened to Maggie? And that's the end of the story. I mean, the open question, what the hell happened to Maggie? Because, on the one hand, it's like, did your mom ever stop dancing? Nope. Did my mom? Nope. And the two women have now lived their lives, right? Like, Roberta has the husband now and the kids, and same thing with Twyla. So there's the question of, like, what the hell happened to Maggie, in the sense that it's like, what became of her? Because they're even like, oh, if Big Bozo could see you now. And it's like, you could just imagine Maggie living the rest of her days in this absolute misery of this orphanage, getting bullied as like this old, so old, Roberta says. That's the one thing she remembers about her. With this, maybe has like developmental maybe has developmental disabilities, like with the little kid hat, and she's described as dumb and everything, just living out the rest of her days in misery, right? So what the hell happened to Maggie? But there's also, I think, this further question, what the hell happened to Maggie, right? What actually took place with this event with the orchard tree, right? Did they really kick her? Was it actually just, they watched, they wanted to, they had the intention to do it? What the hell happened to Maggie, right? There's multiple levels to that. And, she's crying, right? This is the idea of the repression coming out. You can only hold something down until the pressure builds, and eventually there's going to be an outburst. And here we have Roberta crying. Both of them have been very unclear about what actually happened. Twyla, shit, what the hell happened to Maggie? And just totally leaving the reader confused as to what the actual truth of the situation is. You could interpret it 5 different ways, but all of them are just, very tragic. And I don't know if people have specific interpretations of what the hell they think happened to Maggie. But honestly, I almost think they did participate in the kicking, and they kicked Maggie, this old woman, while she was down, and are just repressing it. That's kind of my thoughts. But yeah, I mean, there's clearly and so there's that whole element, which is fantastic, and of course the whole black, white, which is which. Does it actually matter? And why do we think, why are we looking for that in the first place? And then also, why do we think one is this way or the other? Tons of good shit here, and that's the end of the story, and just brilliant. Like, the word that comes to mind for me with this story is actually just genius on so many levels. And so yeah, that's the story. Yep. Yeah, exactly, Poopsie Tutor. I appreciate it that it leaves us with Maggie. Yep. Threw Washing Toad for a loop. Why were we left with why the hell happened to Maggie? Yeah, and so I think I just gave my interpretation. That is like, I think there's the beginning part, but once they're kind of start time skipping and start visiting each other, I almost think at that point the new central thing is what the hell happened to Maggie, right? Because at first, it's like we went different levels here, right? At first, Twyla was like, oh, we just we didn't say anything. The gargoyles pushed her down and we kicked. But then at some point, then Roberta's like, no, we both kicked her. And is she black? Is she not black? She's just like this total mystery figure. And it's almost like, what the hell happened to Maggie? It's almost this frustration with their own, psychological inability to like, what did happen? Like, as the readers and just both of them as characters, we don't know what actually happened. I mean, either way is tragic, but, different implications there. The repressive memory aspect I think is so that's what really stuck with me the first read before I even realized all this other stuff. So fantastic story, tons of good stuff. I think we can wrap it up. I mean, we've been going for quite a minute here, but Recitatif by Toni Morrison, her one and only story, just an absolute banger. So that wraps it up. Poopsie Tutor says, reminds me of online media discourses when you take someone seriously who is outright lying or omitting about factual events. Yeah, that's another element as well. Just like the I mean, this is almost, we even talked about this a little bit with the propaganda stuff with Noam Chomsky. Just this total obfuscation of what actually happened, right? And actually, Poopsie Tutor, I'm glad you brought that up with like this online media discourse, because when we talked about the Noam Chomsky essay with this idea of propaganda and rewriting history, that's very much, I think, a Jungian idea is that society can be viewed of as a collective psychology. So when we talk about the genocide of Native Americans and how that's been completely whitewashed from American history, that's the same principle of what's going on here. It's the repression, right? Just as whatever happened with Maggie, Twyla and Roberta both, blocked it out of their minds, so too with the collective unconscious of America have we blocked out the history of the genocide from our history and from our textbooks, all the other different things. So, and I think that's related to, we see that happening at the everyday, almost like political level with, this media discourse, people outright lying, omitting, having this collective confusion of memory. Washing Toad, it really is possible that they kicked the shit out of her and Twyla has the selective memory where she really doesn't remember, right? And there's no answer. There's no answer to any of these questions in the essay, and it's just, I think, or in the story, and I think that's why it's so brilliant. It leaves it ambiguous, and you have to do interpretation. Because maybe they did just, watch her, and like Roberta said that in a moment of passion. She was clearly very mad at Twyla, so maybe she just said that. So it could go either way. Yeah, exactly. Or why she doesn't address it. Yeah, because I mean, when she hears it, she's like, oh no, like there's no mention at all. Like she talks about Maggie, kind of extensively in the beginning. She was like this old cook woman. She was bow-legged. I don't remember much about her. The only thing I remember is she had legs like parentheses. And it's like, even if she did just watch her get kicked and not participate in it, that doesn't get mentioned at all, really, right? She failed. You can tell this is something she does not want to face head on, like you said, Poopsie Tutor. Which is more evidence for the fact that this is something she's repressing. And why is she repressing it so deeply? There's another way to think about it. Like, why is she so vehemently not thinking about this? Is it because she watched as an 8-year-old girl and she was kind of guilty and she watched these people, kick her? It's like, that might be a bit of an like, if you just watch and you're 8-year-old girl, it's like, it's not the craziest thing that, and there are these 15, 16-year-old girls that bully you anyway, so it's not so crazy that you don't do anything. And is it like, was it really that traumatic that you just refuse to think about it altogether? Like, you have forgotten her skin color, you have forgotten the basic details. That to me almost seems like there is a very, very deep underlying trauma. That is to say, it almost suggests she really went there and did kick the shit out of her, as you said, Washington. That makes it so radioactive for her to think about. Because otherwise, it's a little overreactionary, I think, if they just kind of watched on. But, definitely still within the realm of possibility. So, lots of good stuff. Lots of good stuff. It's just a total... There's so much contained in here, and like everybody's been saying, with each reread, you get more. You pick up on new details. You view it in a new light. And you know what? How about I pose to the chat here? Do you guys have thoughts about whether Roberta or Twyla is white or black? I think I'm just curious if people have thoughts. Obviously, there's going to be no answer, but if you had to guess, because I think for me, I don't think Toni Morrison in a way wrote it where I don't think she had a definite idea that this one was white, this one is black. I think they're kind of almost what's her name? Zadie Smith gives that example. It's like with the yellow blue dress, you know what I'm talking about, where it's like some people when they see it, it's blue and white. When some people see it, it's yellow and blue, whatever it was. And it's like it's like this superposition where it's like if you look at it one way, it's this color. If you look at it this way, it's another color. I think it's almost like that, but I'm curious if anybody does have, if you had to guess which one was which. I don't know. I'm kind of sticking with my original thing that, I thought Roberta was black and I thought Twyla was white as well. That was my intuition, but there's a lot of things here that, beg the question. There's a lot of scenes where it's like, especially to me, the diner scene, like Roberta doesn't want to talk to her. It's almost like she's like ashamed that, Twyla's coming up to her. That very much gives me white coat, like it does make, I think it still makes sense, if Roberta is black and like this white girl comes up when tensions are so high, it's like, I don't even want to be associated with you right now. But like that was a moment for me where I'm like, this almost seems more like Roberta is like a white, it's like I don't want to be associated with this, And then the first thing that happens to with the beginning, ooh, my mom's not gonna like me, my mom's not gonna like that you put me here. That almost read to me as making more sense if Twyla was white, but again, totally ambiguous, All right, well, this was a great discussion, as always, everybody. Thank you guys for everyone who pulled up. I thought this was a, fantastic story. If anyone has final thoughts, they can just drop it in on the comments. And for next week's readings, I was thinking about doing, I forget exactly what it's called, but Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, which kind of sounds boring, but it's interesting, by Walter Benjamin, literary critic, and this idea basically that like art, once it's able to be, it used to be art was like a singular object, right? Like the Mona Lisa. If you wanted to see the Mona Lisa, you have to go and see the individual object. But once art is able to be massively reproduced, it changes art fundamentally, and blah 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 blah. So that's what I'm thinking. I'll post a PDF in the Discord as always. Okay, yeah, nice, cool, good. I think there'll be some interesting stuff with that essay for sure. But I'll post the PDF of the essay by Walter Benjamin. I'm fried. I'll post that and then we'll get to it. But yeah, thank you guys, everyone, so much for a wonderful discussion. Hopefully you guys got something a little extra. And I don't know, I think this story was very good to read just in terms of personal development. It really makes you question your own thoughts and reactions about why you think the thing. I love that it's meta in that way. It's like you feel the need to categorize them. Like, oh, okay, it's almost like a puzzle. Which one's white, which one's black? But first off, why do you feel that need? Second off, why do you associate different cues with like why is this a hint that Twyla is white or that Roberta is black? Why? Right? Just that the confrontation, and like you said, Washington, you sort of questioning yourself. Appreciate it, brother, appreciate it. But all right, enough yapping for now. We're at like the 2-hour mark. Shout out to the Big Nate gang, salute, at ease, and thank you guys for watching Big Nate's Reading Club, home of the best reading clubs.